A single word can end a war. Or start one. In the space between one language and another, empires are built, and surgically dismantled. Not with fire, but with a breath taken in the wrong place. A syllable swapped with the confidence of a man who has never been caught. Language is the oldest weapon ever forged, and the most dangerous, because no one guards what they cannot see. Cheryl Perkins understood this better than anyone in the room. The 34th floor of Aldridge and Fenn smelled of aged leather and authority, the kind that never needs to raise its voice. Outside, a gray November rain blurred the city into indifference. Inside, the world was quieted by dark wood and an obsidian table that reflected the faces of the men around it like still water. Cheryl sat 3 chairs from the foot of the table, a position that communicated exactly how little she was expected to matter. Her notepad was open, her pen uncapped. Everything about her charcoal blazer and mother's pearl earrings said, "I am professional. I am here to serve." She had spent 18 months perfecting this costume. She wore it the way a deep-sea creature wears camouflage, not for vanity, but for survival. Her lanyard read, "Secondary Interpreter, Meridian Language Services." She was a last-minute addition, an administrative shadow. No one offered her coffee, no one even looked her way. She was, by design, invisible. What they didn't know, what her agency profile had been carefully scrubbed to hide, was that Cheryl had spent 6 years in Seoul as a federal intelligence linguist. She was one of only 3 analysts cleared for live wire intercepts of the Korean Mafia. She possessed a rare architecture of the mind, the ability to translate not just words, but the emotional temperature of a sentence. She had been the best. Until 18 months ago, when her integrity became inconvenient, and her career was dismantled with clinical efficiency. The door opened at precisely 2 o'clock. Yoo Jaehyun entered the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was lean, still, and dressed in a dark suit with an open collar. At the juncture of his neck, the edge of a dark tattoo was just visible, the only evidence that his power hadn't originated in boardrooms. He moved with the gait of a man who had never once wondered if his presence was welcome. He looked at the room like a chess player assessing a mid-game board. His eyes moved once to the far end of the table. They registered Cheryl, completely, impersonally, and then he sat. The room arranged itself around him. Attorney Reeves, a senior partner who charged $800 an hour, launched into introductions. Holt and Price, the Americans from Vantage Pacific, were the predatory smiles of men who mistake preparation for victory. And then there was Sung, the primary interpreter. To the room, Sung was polished expertise. To Cheryl, he was a performance. His confidence was a millimeter too calibrated. A genuine interpreter does not pause before proper nouns. The name is part of the sentence, it arrives with the flow. But in the first 2 minutes, Sung paused, a third of a breath, before rendering Jaehyun's name. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Cheryl, it meant Sung was not retrieving language from fluency, he was selecting it. She drew a single small line in her notepad, not a word, just a mark. A con artist doesn't lead with a lie, they build trust one honest sentence at a time. Then, when you've stopped checking their work, they change one word. Cheryl had stopped trusting people 18 months ago. She realized now, with a cold certainty, that she wasn't here as a backup. She was a witness to something that hadn't happened yet. Whoever had arranged for her to be in this room hadn't realized she was the only person capable of hearing the betrayal. The real meeting was about to begin. Cheryl, invisible at the end of the table, felt a cold thread of her old self pulling taut in her chest. She remembered her mother's voice, "Every word you speak honestly is a brick. Build something that holds." She wouldn't get involved. She had promised herself that. But a lie was already in the room, gathering itself in the space between Sung's smile and Jaehyun's folded hands. For now, she would only listen. She would be absolutely certain. And then, she would act. Cheryl has spent 18 months trying to stay invisible to survive. Now, she's the only one who can stop $1 billion theft. If you were her, would you stay silent to keep your job, or risk everything to tell the truth? Let me know in the comments. Reeves was speaking again. Cheryl's pen moved in small, dutiful strokes. Her surface was perfectly still, but underneath, her mind traveled back 18 months to a beige government office and a manila folder she had never asked for. She hadn't just applied to the FBI, she'd been recruited. At 26, she was one of 3 analysts in the country cleared for live Korean language intercepts. The other 2 were men with decades of experience. Cheryl was outperforming them within a year. Her supervisor, Garrett, called it a rare architecture of the mind. She had held that phrase like a treasure. Until the day Garrett placed that folder on her desk. Across the table, Sung was translating a standard indemnification clause. Accurate, so far. Cheryl noted it without releasing her attention. The folder had contained a 42-second wire intercept. It wasn't art, it was a confession. A Korean crime lieutenant and a senior American official discussing laundered funds. Cheryl rendered it perfectly. She signed her name at the bottom, clean, correct, and lethal to the American official's career. Garrett had looked at her, his eyes avoiding hers, and told her the translation needed to be adjusted for clarity. She said no. First, with professional composure. 3 days later, when he stopped asking and started ordering, she said it again. A week later, her life was dismantled. Her clearance was revoked for procedural mishandling, a digital paper trail she hadn't created, and testimonies from colleagues she barely knew. She fought it until her savings hit zero and her reputation was a ghost. She took the job at Meridian because they were the only ones who didn't ask about her history. They only asked if she could show up on time. The cost of her integrity lived in the small, incomplete sentences she used when calling her mother in Baltimore. Her mother, who taught children that their words were sacred, now watched her daughter be treated like office furniture, functional, interchangeable, and invisible. Cheryl kept her eyes on the notepad. Sung finished a preliminary ownership clause. The Korean reached her ears a fraction of a second before his English followed. The translation was there. A breath in the wrong place. Not before the noun this time, before the verb. It was the hesitation of a man assembling a sentence rather than receiving one. He wasn't speaking the language, he was operating it. The word he chose was technically accurate. But the pause told her he had considered a different one first. Cheryl's pen didn't stop. In the left margin, pressed against the spiral binding where no one would look, she wrote a single Korean character. False. Not a verdict. Not yet. Just an observation in the language no one in this room believed she spoke. She kept her face a mask. She kept listening. 20 minutes in, the preliminary courtesies were gone. On the table sat the documents at the center of the storm, the transfer framework for Yoo Jaehyun's billion-dollar American portfolio. 14 properties. 2 commercial towers in Chicago, a waterfront parcel in Seattle, and a series of strategic developments. For Jaehyun, this wasn't just an investment, it was a bid for legitimacy. For the men across the table, it was a kill. Cheryl watched the pattern emerge like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Sung's method wasn't crude, it was architectural. When Jaehyun spoke conditionally, subject to audit, pending verification, Sung rendered them as polite flexibilities. When the Americans offered hollow assurances, we anticipate a smooth process, Sung translated them as binding guarantees. He wasn't changing facts. He was tilting the weight of the words. Clause by clause, he was building 2 different deals in the same room. Cheryl's notations moved from single characters to compressed shorthand, the systematic ledger of a federal case file. Her old instincts were fully awake, running cold and clear. She was no longer an observer, she was building a record of a crime. 3 times, Jaehyun asked a clarifying question. 3 times, Sung's response was immediate, smooth, and subtly, carefully wrong. It was the displacement of a compass needle held near a hidden magnet. Jaehyun's face gave nothing away. Either he trusted his translator completely, or he was the most controlled man Cheryl had ever seen. Then, just once, his eyes moved to her. It wasn't a curiosity. It was a methodical inventory. She was a variable being assessed, a data point of undetermined relevance. His gaze held hers for 2 seconds, then returned to the documents. Cheryl didn't look away first. Reeves slid a new folder across the table. The ownership transfer clause. The crown jewel. This single page would determine who held irrevocable title to all 14 properties. Holt leaned forward. The room's energy compressed like the air before a lightning strike. Sung cleared his throat. Jaehyun spoke with unambiguous clarity, I'm SI. Meaning, temporary. Conditional. Revocable. Cheryl watched Sung's mouth. She saw the shape of the lie before he even spoke it. Her pen went still against the notepad. Behind the professional mask she had spent 18 months constructing, her heart began its low, catastrophic drum. The trap was sprung. The word Sung had chosen was, Yanggujik. Permanent. Cheryl knew the difference the way she knew her own name. Temporary versus permanent. It was the difference between a lease and a deed. Between a partnership and a surrender. It was the difference between Yoo Jaehyun retaining $1 billion empire and signing it away in a single afternoon. She felt the knowledge in her hands first, a fine tremor she stilled by pressing her palms flat against the obsidian. Then, her chest, the low, terrible drumming of a mind that had reached its limit. She remembered Garrett's voice 18 months ago, asking her to adjust for clarity. She had said no, and she had been erased. For 18 months, she told herself that her silence was the price of integrity. But watching this robbery happen in real time, she realized the truth, her silence hadn't protected her. It had only protected the liars. Silence had a price. She had already paid it in full. She wasn't willing to pay it again. Cheryl set down her pen. The sound was a soft click, but in that pressurized room, it landed like a gunshot. Several eyes flicked toward her, then dismissed her. They expected her to be furniture. She didn't look at the lawyers. She didn't look at the traitor, Sung. She looked directly at Yoo Jaehyun and spoke in clean, formal Korean. Her voice was level, precise, and lethal. That word was temporary. Not permanent. The room fractured. Sung's face went rigid, his practiced ease dropping away like a mask. Reeves' hand froze over the document. Holt and Price exchanged looks of pure, uncomprehending confusion. They knew something had happened, but they didn't have the tools to read it. And Yoo Jaehyun, the stillest man in the room, went absolutely silent. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a building settling after a load-bearing wall has been kicked out. Behind his eyes, everything recalculated. Every data point he had collected since entering the room reassembled into a new, dangerous picture. Cheryl sat with her hands flat on the table, her face a mask of professional composure while her heart screamed. This was the skill she had perfected in 1,000 boardrooms, the ability to hold terror behind a surface of ice. She waited. Yoo Jaehyun's eyes moved from the document. Slowly. Deliberately. With a patience that was more terrifying than anger. He didn't look at the Americans. He didn't look at Cheryl. He looked at Sung. And he stayed there. Yoo Jaehyun raised his hand. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just a slight elevation of his palm, but the effect moved through the room like a current through water. Reeves stopped mid-sentence. Holt's pen hovered, suspended. Price sat back, realizing he no longer had the vocabulary to navigate this room. Sung's composure finally fractured, a tightening at the jaw, a flicker of panic. Jaehyun spoke to Sung in Korean. His voice was low and flat, like deep water. He asked Sung to retranslate the last 3 clauses. Verbatim. Sung began to fray. A lie cannot be reconstructed on demand because it isn't built on truth, it's built on what the listener needs to hear. By the 3rd clause, the seams were gone. Sung paused too long, contradicting himself so obviously that even the Americans realized the deal had failed. Then, Yoo Jaehyun turned to Holt and Price. "We are done with the theater," he said. He spoke in English. Flawless, unaccented, and cold. The color drained from Holt's face. The man they thought they were outmaneuvering, the foreign titan, who supposedly needed a bridge into their world, had been standing on their side of the river the entire time. He had heard every word they thought was hidden. Jaehyun cited the ownership clause. He cited the word permanent, and then he looked at the document as if it were trash. He turned back to Sung and spoke 4 words in Korean. Cheryl translated them in a whisper before she could stop herself. "We are done here." Sung stood. His chair scraped against the floor, the only loud sound in the room. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. Jaehyun's 2 associates moved to flank him with the quiet inevitability of a closing trap. Sung walked out between them. He didn't look back. Reeves tried to speak, the vocabulary of damage control and liability, but Jaehyun looked at him, and the lawyer's $800 an hour momentum simply died. The room was cleared with eerie efficiency. Holt, Price, and the lawyers were escorted out until the obsidian table held nothing but the overhead light. Cheryl didn't move. Her notepad was closed, her hands folded. She was, for the first time, genuinely afraid of what came next. The room was empty except for the 2 of them. Jaehyun had not looked at her. Then, he did. He didn't speak immediately. Yoo Jaehyun stood by the window, his back to the room. He looked at the rain-blurred city with the same unhurried attention he gave everything else. He was still, the kind of stillness that acts as its own form of pressure. He was waiting for her to break the silence. Cheryl didn't break. She had spent 18 months doing nothing but waiting. When he finally turned, he skipped the formalities. He looked across the empty room and asked the only question that mattered: "Why did you say anything?" Not how did she know, or who was she. He wanted a reason. A true one. Cheryl thought about giving a careful, protected answer. She had been building those for over a year. She was tired of the architecture. She told him the truth, the skeleton of it. The FBI career. The intercept. Garrett's folder. Her refusal to change a word and the erasure that followed. She didn't apologize or qualify her story. She stated it like a translation, accurate, complete, and in the correct register. He listened without expression. When she finished, the silence changed. It was no longer a test, it was a calculation. "What was the document?" he asked. "A surveillance intercept," she replied. "From which operation?" "An organized crime monitoring program. A conversation between a Korean leader and an American official." He looked at her steadily. "Whose organization?" This was the exit. She could have said she didn't know the full scope. It would have been technically true. It would have cost her nothing. Instead, she said, "Yours." Something shifted behind his eyes. It wasn't surprise, it was the look of a man watching the final piece of a puzzle click into place. He had been working a problem in the dark, and she had just handed him the light. He raised a hand, a silent command to stop. "I need to think." For the first time since 2 o'clock, Cheryl's fear changed. It was still there, but underneath it was a new, unfamiliar sensation. She was finally in a room with someone who wasn't pretending the truth away. They held each other's gaze. Neither spoke. The question hung between them, unspoken but absolute. "What do we do now?" He ended the meeting without a dismissal. He simply said he needed time, and that she would hear from him. Yoo Jaehyun did not say things he did not mean. Cheryl left the 34th floor exactly as she had arrived, a shadow with a lanyard. For the next 9 days, she lived in a state of held breath. She translated pharmaceutical contracts and immigration depositions. She was punctual, accurate, and invisible. She told herself she wasn't waiting, but she checked the financial news twice a day for any ripple from YJH Holdings. The silence of corporate machinery absorbing a hit is the loudest kind of quiet there is. On the 9th day, the silence broke. A man arrived at the agency and asked for her by name. He didn't work for Meridian, his suit was too sharp, his manner too still. He handed her a sealed envelope and vanished. Cheryl retreated to the break room. Her hands were steady. After 18 months, composure was no longer a performance, it was structural. The envelope contained 43 pages. She read them under the hum of fluorescent lights. It was a systematic reconstruction of her own life. Internal FBI communications. Financial transfers. A chain of command that didn't end with Garrett, but far above him, with a senior official named Whitfield. Garrett hadn't invented the pressure. He had just been an instrument. Just like Sung. The dossier revealed a coordinated war against Yoo Jaehyun's empire. A dissident faction inside Jaehyun's own organization was working with American officials to poison his legitimization. Sung was just one node. A falsified filing in Chicago was another. A redirected letter in Seattle was a third. The goal wasn't a single explosion. It was erosion, the slow poisoning of every relationship Jaehyun built, one mistranslated word at a time. Cheryl realized then, she hadn't been collateral damage. She was a preemptive strike. The intercept she'd refused to falsify 18 months ago would have exposed the entire network. They didn't erase her for what she had done, they erased her for what she would have done when the stakes got this high. She set the last page down. The coffee machine hissed. At the bottom of the stack was a small card with a Midtown address and a time. Beneath it, 4 words. Mr. Yoo requests the courtesy. She didn't open the garment bag that night. She hung it on her door and slept with the card from the envelope on her nightstand, face down. In the morning, she opened it. The suit was charcoal Italian wool, a garment built to hold its shape. She had bought it the week she made senior analyst, a private celebration of a woman who intended to be taken seriously. She had kept it sealed for 18 months, preserving it for a future she wasn't sure she still had. She put it on. She looked in the mirror. She saw her old self. Not the diminished shadow of the last year, but the woman who walked into federal buildings with a badge and a brief. She had forgotten what that felt like. She arrived at the Midtown address at 9:57 a.m. Yoo Jaehyun's office was on the 41st floor, spare, restrained, and quiet. No obsidian table, no theater. Just a man who had nothing to prove. He gestured for her to sit. He laid out the offer with his signature economy. His legitimate holdings, real estate, logistics, international legal interfaces, had been compromised by people who wanted him kept in the shadows. He needed to rebuild his infrastructure. He needed someone with flawless Korean and an integrity that had been, as he put it, documented under fire. He named a salary. He named a title. He didn't use persuasion, he knew he didn't need to. Then, he mentioned the attorney. He had already engaged a whistleblower specialist for her. The dossier was enough to open an investigation into Whitfield. Her clearance revocation would be contested and overturned. He wasn't doing this out of generosity, exposing Whitfield dismantled his enemies. Their interests simply aligned. Cheryl sat with the weight of it. She had no illusions. Jaehyun was not a philanthropist, and the world she was entering was more dangerous than the one she left. But the legitimate world had destroyed her with a manila folder and a lie. This world was handing her the evidence and telling her the truth. My mother was a schoolteacher in Baltimore, Cheryl said. She taught her students that their words were the only thing that belonged to them. That language was sacred. Jaehyun waited. For 18 months, I used that lesson to say nothing. I facilitated transactions that didn't matter for people who looked through me. What I did in that conference room wasn't brave, it was a refusal. I refused to let one more word go wrong because I was afraid of the cost. She looked him steadily in the eye. I already know the cost. I paid it in full. I'd rather pay it for something that matters. She picked up the card from the desk. When do I start? He said, Monday. 6 months later, Seoul was raining. This wasn't the sideways Manhattan rain of that November. This was a soft, quiet precipitation that turned the Han River to pewter and the glass towers into mirrors. Cheryl stood at the head of a conference table on the 28th floor in Uedo. She looked at the city for exactly 3 seconds before the room filled and the work began. The table seated 12. On one side, Yoo Jaehyun's restructured division, on the other, a senior investment group. They were here to sign a massive logistics corridor agreement. Cheryl had spent 11 days living inside these documents until they thought back at her in both languages. She was not the backup. There was no backup. She was the lead language and legal liaison. When she moved through the room, distributing summaries, settling disputes in Korean before the meeting even started, people wrote down what she said. Not because she asked them to, but because her words were precise, complete, and final. Her posture had changed. The practiced smallness, the costume of a woman trying to take up as little space as possible, was gone. What remained was something quieter. Permanent. The world she had left was finally answering for its lies. Whitfield was under federal investigation. Corroborating evidence from her old colleagues had surfaced. Her clearance revocation was being contested. But Cheryl had stopped organizing her identity around the answer. She didn't need a bureau to tell her she was valid. Sung was cooperating with investigators to reduce his charges. He was no longer anyone's instrument. At the far end of the table, Yoo Jaehyun sat in his usual state of watchful attention. He watched her work with the same unhurried regard he'd had in New York. There was no warmth, he wasn't that kind of man, but there was a settled satisfaction. He had made an assessment of her character, and he was being proven right. The meeting ran 3 hours. When the room emptied, Cheryl stood at the window. A different city. A different life. But the same truth, the world is held together by the integrity of its words. 18 months ago, that was a principle. Now, it was her foundation. She took her mother's notebook from her jacket. Small, worn, and soft. She had carried it since Georgetown but had never opened it on the job. She had been saving it for something that deserved it. She opened it now. Inside the cover, in her mother's emphatic script, every word you speak honestly is a brick. Build something that holds. Cheryl looked out at Seoul. She had lived here for 6 years as a ghost, careful never to leave a mark. Now, she was standing in it as herself. The difference wasn't the city or the view. It was her. She thought of the word that started it all, IMSI. Temporary. Everything they had tried to make of her, the erasure, the silence, the 18 months of smallness, it had all been temporary. The version of her that had learned to want less and expect less. Temporary. She was still here. She was still speaking. And every word she said was true. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. That choice matters more than you know. If this story stayed with you, what comes next goes even deeper, stranger, darker, and far more revealing. Stay with me. I'll see you in the next one.